episode about the great power competition because it was something that we were like learning about in debate, and we thought it would be interesting to talk about because I feel like it's relevant.
It is relevant.
Yeah.
Because of our great power competition strategy.
Yeah.
So we haven't had like a tournament yet, but we have one on like the 5th of November. So like
Yeah.
But
let's just
we've
like
been doing research.
Yeah, and I feel like it's actually helped us understand like a lot about Russia and Ukraine, oddly, and like stuff going on with that. So
Yeah. So yeah, let's intro here.
what is the great power competition?
That's a great question. I mean, it's kind of like a more of a vague term, but essentially what it means is like great powers competing against each other, like in all different avenues, like economically, militarily. So like the U.S. building its military and building its economy and its innovation techniques to like compete with like China and to compete with Russia, which are basically considered the two greatest powers besides the U.S. because the U.S. is like the most powerful country right now, but like the two, like our biggest, I guess, like you could say threat right now is China. So
yeah. And so, like Celine said, there's three main, like, countries that are in the competition, and it's Russia, the U.S., and China. And the main areas that, like, the competition is, like, in regards to is military power, economic power, and political influence / political power. So, those are, like, the three factors. In terms of, like, who's winning, I mean, like, there's not really, like, a definite way to determine who's winning. But in military power, the U.S. does have the strongest military in the world at the moment. But there was actually, like, an article that someone reposted about, like, how the U.S. military was ranked weak for, like, the first time ever. And that was really interesting because that was just rare. I don't know. I feel like it was really strange that the world's strongest military was, like, considered kind of weak for, like, the first time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting to see. And it's also like the Great Power Competition, like the reason why it's a thing. It's not like an official like, oh my god, we're in a competition.
Yeah.
It's just like
it's kind of more of like a strategy that we use, and it was introduced in the Trump administration. I think it was like 2017 or like 2018, and before this, kind of our main strategy was like counterterrorism, which like a lot of people felt didn't work very well, so we kind of like transitioned into this. It's as Ahana said, it's not some like super official thing, but it just basically means that we're competing.
Yeah, it's like what we're doing to keep our military, economic, and political power at the top.
Yeah, rather than just like being more diplomatic and stuff.
And like kind of the reason that we want to compete like with other countries are probably like, I mean, you probably noticed how like the U.S. is always trying to build its economy and like assert dominance over things that like kind of has nothing to do with the U.S. Like it will like put troops in like third world countries and stuff to like protect them, and you're like, what does that even have to do with the U.S.? Like one of the reasons is because they're competing for power, but the reason that they want to compete for power is because if they don't compete with power, then countries such as Russia or China will take the top dog seat, and that will mean that the values of those countries will kind of become like the role model for like what the power is.
That can mean like having an authoritarian government, or like having like these different ideals of like undemocratic ideals, and also like having just more influence, because the U.S. has a lot of influence on the world right now, but if it had been China having a lot of influence on the world, our world would probably look vastly different just because of their differing like ideologies and like everything that's so different about their country.
Yeah, and China does have a lot of influence, but it just doesn't have the extent of influence.
Right.
And if China or Russia was the top dog, those are like both like communist countries, and that could be like really dangerous because that could mean like communism could be like a mold of what is a right government. And it could also like ensure them a lot of power, and like even if it isn't like written down, people know that like the top dog typically has like more of a say in things. It has more of a like control over what the other countries can do. And because that's the U.S., we're able to like make sure that our values and like the democratic ideals are still like apparent within the world. But if it was like China, then they could do a lot of stuff with their role. It's like the democratic, or like not democratic, but as like the winner of the great power competition.
Yeah, exactly. So there are like a lot of arguments like for why we should compete. Like one of them, as Ahana was talking about, was just like keeping China from being like the most powerful country, because it is getting a lot more power. Some people, there there are a lot of like differing views. Sorry. Differing views on it. Like some people think that China will rise to power in the future, or some people think the U.S. will always be like the world's superpower. So it really just depends. But yeah, that's kind of a huge argument for like why it's a good thing.
So before we dive into like specific arguments of like why the competition is good or bad, let's just like define some terms that I feel like are important.
Yeah.
So what is unipolarity?
Yeah, so unipolarity is basically like having one like country or one power kind of like basically rule the world or just be the most powerful. And it's the opposite of multipolarity, which is like having several like main countries or powers kind of like having the most influence. So if like we had a world where like the US, China, and Russia were all like equally powerful, that would be multipolarity. But right now we have unipolarity because the US is essentially the most powerful.
I'm gonna talk about like why multipolarity can be dangerous later on, but along with like that, there's a word that's really similar called hegemony.
Yeah.
Hegemony is kind of similar to unipolarity. It's basically just like that there's like one main power that's kind of like in the lead, and that's important too. So let's go into like the arguments for why the great power competition is good and why it can be helpful, and then the second half we'll go into the negative side of it. So like Slade said, one of these reasons is multipolarity is dangerous because it encourages like power struggles, and by that it means that like if you think about it in a way, if there's always someone who you know is a number one like in leader, like a teacher, for example, if you know that the teacher is always going to be in higher authority than the teacher's assistant or the students, then you're not going to be as bold as in if the classroom was led by only students. Because if it was led by only students, then you would think, hey, we're on the same level. I can compete with this one to more of an extent than I would if they were higher up than me. And so it's like kind of like a power dynamic sort of situation. Like you're less likely to overthrow the king if you're a peasant versus if you were like a prince, right? So like if you're lower on the great power competition sort of scale, if you are like lower than the number one person, you're less likely to try to overtake it because you know they're more powerful and you know they have more authority. So, and if we were on equal pedestals as like China and Russia, then we would probably see them taking more like drastic measures against the US and against other countries to kind of like show and to like try to get ahead. Because a part of like that sort of like political nature is that like one country always wants to be better. Like they're not okay with being the same. So when they are the same, they're going to compete more than if they are staggered in like levels of power.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like deterring other people from like trying to gain more power, like other countries. And then another like kind of like bigger thing for like why it's good is that it increases like innovation a lot, because like when countries are competing, there's a lot of like competition over like military and like over technology, which helps us like develop a lot of like new technologies and like all this new stuff. And like one of the big things is climate change, because when other countries are doing all these things to like help climate change or come up with these solutions, then we want to be better than them, so we're gonna also try to come up with these great solutions, which is like basically giving us kind of motivation to actually like solve these issues and like innovate with these new ideas, which is like a good thing.
Yeah. And along with like military, like going into more specifically like certain scenarios that the great power competition is good, I'll talk about Russia and Ukraine, because that's like one of the biggest things that I feel like has happened recently. So if you didn't know, Russia has invaded Ukraine in hopes to like conquer it, and that happened in like February, I think. It's been a very long time, and the fight is still ongoing. A lot of people saw this move as a move by Russia to assert global dominance and like try to get higher up on the political influence sector of the great power competition, and if they were able to conquer Ukraine, which the Russian government thought it would be, then that would greatly increase their not only like scare factor, but also just like their dominance over other parts and like the risk of them taking over other parts of Europe and like conquering more land, which is like so dangerous in so many different ways. And what the great power competition did is, because Russia like kind of made this big move, the US felt threatened by it, right? Because that would kind of like threaten the US's position in like political power, and that made the US react in a way that probably wouldn't have occurred if the US wasn't using this great power of competition strategy and the US wasn't like a top dog in the competition. So a lot of people thought that the US isn't doing anything, but the US has actually donated billions of dollars to aid to Ukraine. So many missile protection, like so many different defense systems and military equipment that Ukraine has used and probably wouldn't have been able to survive the war without. This, like, I think a lot of people don't think the U.S. is doing anything because we're not like actively sending our troops there, but our financial and military like equipment aid has done so much for Ukraine, and it's like, I honestly think the reason Ukraine's holding up so well is because of that. So
along with other nations.
Along with other nations.
But definitely the aid from other nations has helped a lot. Is that everything kind of like for AF, do you think? Should we move on to the next half?
Let's end this first half. If we have anything we didn't mention for AF, we'll mention it in the second half at the beginning, but then we'll move on to the like why the great power competition might be bad in the second half. So Alright, so we realized like we left out some parts of the AF that we're gonna like briefly discuss. These are like kind of really specific examples just to like to give you some relevant info. The first one is about the Arctic. It's really like, I feel like no one knows about this, but it's kind of random. But basically there's like a lot of like military and economic activity in the Arctic, meaning that it is like really important for the great power competition, because part of the great power competition is the economy and part of it is the military, and those are like both things going on in the Arctic. So in recent years, Russia and China has been like increasing their military and like economic activity there, and they would have done way more with it if the US like didn't have such a presence there, and if the US stopped implementing its strategy and sort of like backed down from being in the great power competition, then that could mean that like the Russia and Ukraine governments could like institute bases there and like just increase their presence a lot there, which could help them a lot with like different military aspects and economic aspects. So like the US maintaining its dominance helps prevent military buildup from the different competing countries, which is really important. So
and that's a good point. And like another one is kind of like helping these like smaller like things, or like like helping like nations in like Africa, or like, as Hannah said, like the Arctic, which we normally wouldn't have like concentrated any like help there, but they can actually help us because they have a lot of like natural resources, they have a lot of trade. You know, we can make like all these agreements with them, which helps our economy and that helps us, but we wouldn't have done that if other powers hadn't been like competing for influence there, because like we want as much influence as we can get because of great power competition and this ideal that we have to compete, and because China is like having all this influence in like the Arctic and like all these areas, we also want the influence, which is like essentially one of the only reasons why we even like make these deals with these nations, which ends up benefiting us in the end. So.
Definitely. And like kind of like going off of what you said, international relations is a very, very important thing in like this debate of whether it's important or not, because by the US like wanting to maintain power, that means that we like kind of are forced to keep connections with smaller countries, like Celine said, and that doesn't even like necessarily mean that we're like best friends with them, but we just need to keep a sort of cordial like allyship. I don't think that's a word.
We need to pay attention to them. I feel
we need to pay attention to them, and from us paying attention to these smaller countries, it not only like institutes democratic ideals in them and like sort of like increases our power, but it also like boosts trade a lot, which is really good, boosts the economy.
It's like it helps them and it helps us, so like everyone's benefiting.
And it's also like if we have a lot of small countries on our sides, that equates like a couple big countries.
Right.
So at the end of the day, if we're getting a lot of smaller countries on our side because of the great power competition strategy, then that's sort of like giving us the benefit of being allied with large countries, because
Exactly.
a bunch of small ones make a big one, I guess.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's everything for AF. What do you think?
I think that's everything for
Yeah.
why it's good. Now let's
Yeah.
go into why it can be bad.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of like arguments, like kind of like against like basically everything we've been saying for AF, and I think one of the bigger ones is that like we'll never really have like one power who stays in power for a long time, because the more that we have like hegemony, the more that people want to compete for that power because they want to be more powerful. So when you're competing, you're just like deteriorating alliances and like creating more conflict that could eventually end up with war or something like really drastic that can be bad.
It's kind of like, honestly, this is kind of a weird analogy, but it sort of like reminds me of dictatorship, of how like, of course you are scared of a person who's more powerful than you, but at a point it gets to a point where people will group together to overtake the leader.
It's like
Yeah.
exactly.
It's like if there's one thing in power for so long, then people are going to group together. Even if they can't do it individually, they'll group together and try to take it down. Which is why I feel like China and Russia are sort of forming an alliance, especially recently, against like the US. And we've noticed that with like Russia or China, sort of like there's like sort of been a little bit of like rumors / evidence of China sort of supporting Russia and things like that. And so like we already are seeing them like sort of bonding together already to take down the US in a sense. But I feel like that's definitely something that happens with hegemony. So
yeah, and then another thing is that like there's this whole argument that it'll help democracy, but it can also like make democratic ideals like less important, because like when other countries are competing and they have their own like communist ideals, theirs can become more popular through the competition, which makes it like even more accentuated than it would be. And like if we're not like being diplomatic, we can also lose a lot of alliances. Like one of the main arguments I think that's a really strong one is that we should be focusing more on diplomacy and making important strong alliances than competing with other countries, because what matters the most is like having strong bonds with countries and like international ties rather than like trying to be better than them.
Yeah, I also agree with that. Talking more about the economy, right?
What?
Should I talk more about the economy? Yeah. So the economy, like we said, how it could boost trade because we're getting help from other countries, but it can also slow our economy in a different way, because we're so concerned with like competition. Like we keep trying to compete with like these different countries like Russia and China to the point where we sort of like avoid cooperation with those countries in terms of the economy because we're so busy competing with them.
Exactly.
And that like us avoiding competition, that kind of slows trade, and the trade perfectionism in a sense slows economic growth.
Yeah.
And this was seen in like the Trump economy war of like 2018. That was like kind of when Trump and China had a big sort of tiff, to put it lightly, and that was like a big deal to do for them. So yeah.
Yeah. And then just one more thing about economy is that like wait, what was I gonna say? I swear to God, I had something and it was like actually not. Oh, okay. So like if we're spending so much money on like military expenditures, which we will have to increase the amount of money we spend on military with great power competition, then we're spending so much money on that we have so much less money for like things like education and like things within our own country that actually matter. So
like we're taking more importance to our like stature and our titles rather than the people in our country.
Exactly.
Which like could be seen as like neglect of the people.
Yeah. So is that everything, do you think?
I think that's pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Of course there's more points. These are like the main basic points. And there's definitely a lot of depth to this situation, more than we're like bringing to light. But you know, that's kind of like just to give you guys a basic understanding, and I feel like it's really important when applied to like what's going on with Russia, China, and like Taiwan and Ukraine and just everything with that.
Yeah.
So,
all right. So hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned and thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.